Steve.
How's it going?
Oh, it's great. It's great. I tapped some sugar maples
Nice. Are they running?
slowly.
Mm-hmm.
Last 2 days ago and today a little bit.
Yeah, it's the most normal year we've had in a while in terms of February. So just waiting patiently.
You got any plans this week?
We'll see. Hopefully it'll break this weekend and we'll get some sap and be on our way. But yeah, we'll see. We don't have any control over that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have lines?
Yes, we do.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we'll get started here. We're gonna wrap up this webinar series with our third webinar here tonight. And I'm going to start off the evening here talking about some of the farm business, some of the pieces to become a farm, and then some of the ways the fresh mushrooms are handled and sold, and talk about some of the logistics of that. And then I'll toss it over to Willie for the end of the webinar. We'll get into a little detail about fruiting and some big picture ways that fungi are going to continue to grow and expand and flood the world, hopefully. Happy to have you all here. Just as a reminder, I put a link in the chat for the Fungi Alley website, which is our home base for this project. And there you can find all the links to the assignments and tools that we have offered through this. We're going to be posting a link for the application to be joining us for the next step in this adventure. We'll post that probably by noon tomorrow is our goal. And you'll get an email with the link to that, but it will be posted to that Fungi Alley page, so you can check there as well. And yeah, we're hoping to get some folks who are already growing or are ready to jump in to participate in our project, which is to collect data about different methods, and as we've talked about in the last webinar, and collect some data about labor and material costs associated with those, so that we can hopefully coalesce that data along with the work we're doing here at Cornell, and provide some in-depth data back to the community about different methods and their cost benefits. So I'm really excited for that. Getting the research underway here on campus and comparing straw production and block production systems in a controlled environment. So let's jump right in and get into this question of when am I a farm, and talk about that a little bit. So this is the checklist I would suggest considering working with when you're becoming a farm in the US. You can start really considering yourself a farm when you accomplish or start working on all these kind of pieces. So there's 6 main things. One is to really declare that you're intending to sell, or you're actually selling some kind of farm product. The ag census often says $1,000 minimum is when you start reporting to that agency. But technically, whenever you're intending, even if you're not selling products, you can start filing and claiming some of the benefits of being a farm. Really recommended that you register a name, a farm name. So a DBA is doing business as, an LLC is a limited liability corporation. DBAs are nice because you can work with a county. Usually is about $25, something like in that range, and it takes about 20 minutes to fill out the paperwork, and you have a name now associated with your business. LLC is a little more details. There's a few more details in there. You need to file with the state that you're in generally, and have some kind of public notice in newspapers, which are well set up to handle that, and file some articles of organization, things like that. A couple more steps, a little more expensive, usually more in the $250 avenue, But either of these is going to give you the opportunity to start opening a bank account in the name of that entity. And DBAs are nice when you're not maybe sure of the name you're going to use, because you can always accumulate those and then change them over time. And LLC is a little more of a commitment. Third thing would be to open a bank account and really start to track your expenses and income separately from any kind of personal accounting. And the reason we want to do that is to really get a sense of how the business is going. And it's fine if you give yourself a loan, you give the business a loan from your own personal finances if you're getting something started, but it's really important to start separating those. I've worked with farms that sometimes have been going for decades or more, mixing their business expenses with their individual income and expenses, and that can be really hard to track and report at the end of the year. Oh, Willie's saying we're stuck on the first slide. Sorry, folks. Let's see. Should look at a checklist here. Oh, let me share something differently and see if that works. Are we seeing something different now?
Yep, that looks good.
Cool, thanks. So fourth thing would be finally Schedule F, that is profit and loss from farming. That's a federal form with the IRS. Really important to look at that form. We'll check it out in a minute, and start to categorize your expenses in correlation with that form, so that it's really easy at the end of the year to pull everything together and submit that. Fifth thing would be to register with your local farm service agency. This is a USDA, a federal agency that keeps track of farms and links different farm businesses to land bases and gives you a farm number. And this starts to then give you eligibility for insurance, crop insurance, for cost share programs that are offered through USDA and NRCS, which is Natural Resources Conservation Service. And also to facilitate disaster payments. If you have an off year, you can sometimes get benefits from that. And the sixth thing would be to get product liability. If you're going to sell a food product to customers, you want to cover yourself. And so we'll talk a little bit about how to go about that. But that's a piece of the puzzle as well. So the benefits, before you even start to really see income and profit show up on your radar, you can usually start to see the benefits from writing off your farm expenses. Often folks are holding other jobs, or the family has wage income that taxes are taken out of. And by claiming your farm expenses, and in many cases claiming a loss as you're getting your farm going, you can write off and include those, and that really helps your personal financial picture. Many states, if there's a sales tax associated with products that you might be buying for your farm, you don't have to pay sales tax for those. Speaking a little specifically to New York on that, but there's a specific process which I'll share, but you should check with your state agencies to understand the process in order to remove those from your plate. So in New York State, that saves us 8% off of all of our purchases, which can be significant. As I mentioned, we can, as we check off those boxes, become eligible for farm programs through USDA. And often then, as we're a farm, we can also benefit from some kind of ag assessment. In New York State, that's when you gross 10,000 in income or more, you can start to claim the land base that you're using for farming, and you'll get a lower tax rate. In many other states, there's some kind of classification for agriculture, for farming, for forestry. These are all things that can benefit you in terms of your property taxes. So before you even start to gain the income from the business, these are benefits that are really available. And again, we've worked with farmers over the years that sometimes haven't made maximum use of these opportunities from the get-go. Critical to any farm enterprise is to track your transactions. And a lot of farms start off with the shoebox method, which is really just to keep track of your receipts and then deal with the headache at the end of the year of trying to sort everything out, categorize things. Of course, we can take a step further beyond that, but at least, keeping a paper record of transactions, and you're supposed to keep that record for at least 5 years as you claim them on your taxes. most farmers get to a point where they realize that a more sophisticated method of tracking expenses is valuable. And so some kind of software is really nice. QuickBooks is really excellent one in terms of being able to pull from data that shows up in your bank account feed and match that up with invoices and other things that you're doing on the farm. So there's no perfect software out there. There's a lot of different options, but certainly tracking your transactions is going to be part of maintaining a really good farm business. Here's your Schedule F. If we look at the part 2, the farm expenses, it's really important to match your transactions and categorize them based on these expenses. That doesn't necessarily equate to you having the type of categories that you may want. So for example, for our farm, 80% of our expenses usually fall under line 30, which is the supply line. And but I personally and my wife want to know, what are the expenses associated with mushrooms versus our maple syrup production versus our lambs and our sheep. And so we have subcategorized those further, but on this tax form, all of those get lumped into one item that goes on that line. So it's really recommended that you work and build a relationship with a local accountant who's familiar with farm tax policy. They're going to help you benefit to the max in terms of filling out this form and depreciating the assets related to the business and getting you the best value as you file each year. Ag assessment, this is specific to New York. So if you're in a different state, you need to kind of dig deeper, but this is all based on property taxes and land. In New York, if you have at least 7 acres in production and 10,000 in gross sales, you can apply for ag exemption. There's a process that our small farm program outlines in our guide to farming in New York. In New York, you can count 2,000 of that 10,000 can be wood products. And you can actually use mushrooms if they're grown outdoors in a forest environment as the entirety of that 10,000 if you get to that scale. Maple syrup also counts in New York State. So what happens in New York State is they look at the soil value and they basically, if my land was taxed at 2,000 an acre, based on the land values you can see in the chart here, those taxable amounts would be reduced based on being an ag exemption. Key thing to keep in mind with all ag exemption processes, land and property tax exemptions or reductions, is that these are usually programs in states that require you to maintain that level of production, whatever the requirements are. So if you start to change your land use, you start to change your practices, you may be liable for past taxes or those changes. So do your homework, but it can be a significant way to support your farm venture moving forward. Again, in New York State, really simple method for eliminating sales tax from your cost ledger is to use this form ST125. Basically, you fill out your contact information, you sign at the bottom, and you give this to anyone who is who you're buying those materials from. Most of the local feed stores and the hardware stores and things like that are used to this, and so they'll put it on file, they'll attach it to your phone number, and then they'll usually work from there to make sure that when you make a purchase, you just give them your phone number, and then they can automatically deduct that sales tax from your receipt. And then finally, small farm product liability. This article is a couple years old, but it's a really good summary. What's really key with product liability is to find an insurance carrier that is able to create a custom package for you based on your sales, based on your plans. So you want to sit down with someone who understands where your farm is at in year 1, where it may be at in year 10, in year 20, and can adjust the product liability package to meet those needs. So a lot of agencies might offer you a blanket policy or something that's a fixed price. So whether you're selling 100 pounds of mushrooms or 10,000 pounds of mushrooms, you might be paying a similar rate. And that can really hinder young and beginning operations. And so, yeah, what's really important is to do your homework, find someone you want to work with, and find someone who can customize those options. And then, of course, you can add on to product liability things like insuring your equipment or your buildings or things like that. And so Took us a while personally to find. We worked through our local, our Farm Bureau agency. Farm Bureau is a nationwide organization that has an affiliation with Nationwide Insurance. So often those companies are used to working with farmers and farm operations, and those agents can help customize a policy to your needs. But that's certainly not the only one. Farm Family is a common one that's used in the Northeast, and there's some others out there. And if you have a good experience with an insurance provider, feel free to share that in the chat box so folks can get some ideas. What's most important is you actually talk to a human, and that human hopefully visits your farm and builds a relationship with you and works a policy that's customized to your situation. So with fresh mushrooms, we're going to talk a bit about the process of taking them from harvest and safely and in a sanitary fashion, bringing them into market. So we're going to talk about kind of the nuances and the particulars with that at this point. I want to mention that we have a resource, the Cornell Small Farm Program. It's called From Harvest to Market. And so this is an outline of all the post-harvest things you need to consider. Right now, this PDF of this document is we're working on publishing it online as individual fact sheets, and we hope to have that up in just a couple weeks. But I do have the PDF available, and I can make that available. We could post it right to the website that Fungi Ally is hosting this project on if you want to dig into it. But a lot of the things we're talking about here are reiterated in the guide and many more items as we go. So things like regulations around medicinal products, value-added products, those sort of things are covered in this guidebook. And before we kind of dig into the nuance, what I want to encourage folks to think about is that often new farm enterprises and even some established ones are on this teeter-totter, and they overemphasize the technical aspects of farming. In this case, they learn how to grow really nice, high-quality mushrooms, whether that's indoor mushrooms, outdoor mushrooms, or some combination, and they focus on that, and they focus on that, and they start producing pounds and pounds of mushrooms, but they haven't done the business and the marketing side of developing their enterprise. And I'd encourage folks to try to balance this and start asking around, start bringing samples to markets, start exploring what those things look like before you start really ramping up production, because we have too many stories of farms that produce really beautiful products but can't get them to market because they haven't established those pathways and those relationships, and that's a really important thing in order to do that. Sorry. With markets, a really basic way to think about where we're going to sell our mushrooms, we have on the left side here direct markets. So these are markets where we're interacting in some way with an end consumer that's going to eat the mushrooms, enjoy the mushrooms, and come back. Generally speaking, we see a higher price per pound for those direct markets, but also a higher cost of labor and sometimes material inputs in order to provide those products to the market. So this is a chart from a cooperative extension guide here in New York that gets into the nuances of what we call market channels, these different options for how you can get your product. And depending on the scale of your business, your goals, and how you want to spend your time, some markets are going to be more appealing and some are going to be less appealing. And that's really an individual decision. So we look on the right side and we see wholesale markets. These are markets that are generally purchasing your product and then relaying them on to that end consumer. So indirect markets is sometimes the way they're framed. Grocery stores, restaurants, these are common ways that mushrooms are sold on a small local scale, and can be great ways to move volume at a reasonable price. Usually the price per pound is going to be lower, but you're going to do a lot less to get those products to market as we go. So there's no perfect channel here. They all have their pros and their cons, and we have to develop these slowly and over time in order to have a successful mushroom enterprise. So generally speaking, in New York State, I know this is true, and I haven't found a state yet that this is not true, where to sell fresh, uncut, this says shiitake, but really any mushrooms. This is an old slide from a shiitake presentation, but it holds true for all mushrooms. They're lumped together with all vegetables and produce. And so if they're clean and they're in clean containers, then they generally don't require any licenses in order to sell. The exception to that is when you get to a certain threshold where you're selling more than $25,000 in sales, and those sales are outside of a 275-mile range. In essence, they are not local anymore. If you fall into those categories, what you get into is what is known as the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, FSMA. And these are rules that are now in place, produce handling rules, and essentially GAP certification, which we'll talk about in a minute. And so you need to pay attention to those things if you're getting to that type of scale. Generally speaking, whatever scale we're at, however we're working with mushrooms, there's some general good guidelines for sanitation as we harvest these mushrooms and bring them to market. The major difference with mushrooms as compared to other forms of produce is we're not going to wash these mushrooms. Mushrooms are 90% plus water, depending on the species, and washing them generally degrades their quality quite significantly. So it's important to think about that as we handle them and move them from the production area to our markets. So things like really basic ideas like, washing our hands or using gloves as we're harvesting into clean food grade containers. We like to use these stainless steel bowls, which we can sanitize very easily. As we're holding mushrooms in the fridge, we'll use a food safe container to do that. Harvesting with scissors instead of a knife is something we often recommend because you're able to reduce the potential of you nicking yourself and bringing that into the product, and just keeping everything kind of clean and in a clean condition. Now, if you're under those those thresholds I mentioned before, generally speaking, good common sense practices are enough. If you get into those higher echelons, then you have to start to pay attention to produce safety rules and have a little more of a specific setup in terms of being able to process and clean your product. Certification for all farm products, but specifically for mushrooms, is something that is really a marketing question in many cases. Many states, like New York State, have a grown certified program. In New York, that's a combination of an environmental plan for your land as well as a GAP certification. GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. There are good agricultural practice standards specific to mushroom production, and most producers are going to want to think about moving towards GAP certification over time as they develop their enterprise. Most of the sort of standards for GAPs in mushroom production are things that make sense. Providing employees with a place to wash their hands in a sanitary bathroom, cleaning your product in a clean space, and generally keeping track of all these things, having a food safety plan for the farm, having traceability measures so that every lot of mushrooms you're selling has a number associated with it. So if there's any issue, it can be traced back. These are basic things that make sense and are good ideas, and often markets will require these. Some farmers markets require GAP certification. Many wholesale markets do, and so it's a good thing to check out and get involved with. As far as organic or certified naturally grown, these are two programs that offer a sort of certification process where there's standards developed, and those standards are then assessed on your farm every year, and then you can use the logo as a way to market your product. A lot of farmers choose not to do this, especially if their markets are local and their customers are people they interact with. But as your products get further and further from the farm, your customers get further and further from you. These can really be beneficial ways to market your product, and you can often get a premium in terms of the price if you have these certifications. So organic certification would be a third-party certification where a representative from your state agency would come to the farm, complete the certification on an annual basis. You'd pay a fee, and then you'd get that certification. Certified naturally grown, or CNG, is what's called a peer-to-peer certification, where another farmer will actually come to your farm and help complete the paperwork. It's a nice way to have some interaction as well with other folks in the industry. If you're interested, you can dig deeper into the CNG mushroom standards. I was part of a group from multiple states that developed these standards for water quality, for substrate use, for processing and packaging and things like that. And so even if you don't enroll in the program, it provides a nice template to look at in terms of how to adhere to the standards and keep things in the right way. So harvesting our mushrooms and storing them is a really critical part of this. We talked in the past webinars about proper harvesting techniques. So I often get pictures from new growers with these kind of pancake shiitakes or pancake mushrooms where the caps are flat or unfurled. Perfectly edible, perfectly delicious, but not really going to hold up in terms of quality standards in the long term through the transport and storage process with your customers. So really thinking about harvesting our mushrooms a little bit earlier in the process where those caps still have a bit of a curled edge and a bit of rigidity is going to maintain their quality. So the difference between these two pictures might be several days in terms of how they hold up in the fridge. If I were to deliver 5 pounds of the shiitakes there on the bottom to a restaurant after 2 or 3 days, they might open the bag and find them to be kind of yellow or brown and the quality to be degraded, and they're kind of dried out. Versus if I deliver mushrooms in the state of the top photo, those often last a week or more in a refrigerated setting and are going to maintain their quality as they go into the production chain. Storing mushrooms, we don't seal them up in plastic. We use paper or breathable bins, so bins that don't seal. I'll show you an example in a minute. We focus on quantity. We don't want to put too many mushrooms in one bin or bag because that weight can actually degrade their quality over time. And generally we store them in a kind of fridge temperature environment is perfectly fine, or even a bit cooler. So we kind of keep our fridge around 36, 35 degrees as a way to maintain quality on the mushrooms. And like I said, if you harvest them when they're a little underripe, arguably, you're going to have a longer shelf life and they're going to hold up better in transportation and storage. So here's some breathable bins. Basic food grade quality bin. We just get them from a local restaurant supply, and you can also order these online. So the lid just kind of nestles on top, and we usually cover our mushrooms with either a paper bag or a towel in order to keep the moisture from condensing on them and degrading them as they're waiting to go out into the world. Here's some nice golden oysters harvested at a pretty good time, maybe a little past what I'd like. You learn with the different mushroom species what they can tolerate in terms of when you harvest them and how you store them. So golden oysters in particular are a bit more brittle than, for instance, the blue oysters. And so we have to be more considerate in the ways that we handle and take care of them. And as we get ready for markets, a lot of our restaurants that we personally supply to will just double bag them in. They're recycled paper, but they're not recycled as in I just put my groceries in them. We buy them in reams. We double bag them, and then these are a good way for about 5 pounds, 6 pounds of mushrooms to be packaged and sold to these markets. As far as cleaning and grading goes, there are actually like official mushroom brushes out there. We're going to not wash our mushrooms again. We're going to brush them. We're going to clean the debris off them. So we like to just use a simple array of paint brushes from the hardware store. Obviously not paint brushes that we're using to paint things, but solely dedicated to cleaning our mushrooms. So a couple of those, we're dusting off the dirt. We're getting any insects or bugs that might be showing up, especially in our outdoor systems, and then they're ready to go. With some of the shiitakes, particularly I work with shiitake growers who do outdoor production. In the heat of the summer, we can see these thrips show up, and it's important to get them out of there. They don't actually do a lot of damage to the mushrooms, but they do need to be cleaned out. And the worst way to do that is to blow on them, which is one of the old timer ways of doing it. Better ways to do it are to tap the cap of the mushroom to get these bugs out, or even use something like toothpicks or a toothbrush or a small brush in order to brush them out. We try to minimize in our different production system management the presence of these, but again, especially with outdoor production, they're going to show up, and they're an important thing, obviously, to clean out. Grading mushrooms, this is not there's not a standard grading system like with some other products. But it is important to grade your mushrooms and consider what channels are going to accept different qualities. Depending on your customers, depending on what they're paying at a premium price, it's really important to maintain quality. That's what we hear time and time and time again from growers who are successful mushroom producers is they only are successful as they maintain a high quality product. So here's some A-grade shiitakes with nice round caps clean gills, no deformities or damage. So we might call these grade A. Grade B might have a little bit of damage, but mostly are intact and look pretty high quality, but a couple deformities in there, here and there, scattered about. And then grade C, which could be product for what we call the farmer grade. So sometimes these are the ones we're eating, or we might be trimming these off or turning these into value-added products as a future for them. So we grade these out as we're harvesting them. We have different grades, and then we match those to different clients that we're serving through our sales. As far as weighing products, generally speaking, across the board, if items are going to be packaged in something where there's going to be a label and they're going to be put in a retail location, they generally need to be weighed on a certified scale. That's a scale that's actually checked off by your local Bureau of Weights and Measures every year. If you're selling mushrooms in a package to a grocery store, that would be required. If you're selling them in bulk, like you drop off 20 pounds to a grocery store and they display them in a bulk way, customers take what they want and weigh them out, then it's the grocery store's responsibility to have that certified scale. If I'm selling to a CSA or I'm selling to a restaurant, it's essentially an agreement, so I don't have to have a certified scale. We're assuming that we're under the understanding that we're selling them around 5 pounds of mushrooms or something like that. But anytime you put a package and a label on it, you're going to have that kind of requirement met in order to sell them legally in all states. As far as packing and labeling mushrooms, the packaging you require is really in relationship to the markets that you choose. So for us, for our CSA customers, for our restaurants, these are folks who are already committed and bought in. They know what they're getting. So paper bags work great. And again, not paper bags that I just used for some other thing, but we buy recycled paper bags from our local supplier and package our mushrooms up in that. If I was selling at a farmer's market, I would want to display the mushrooms so that consumers can see them. I like those cardboard clamshells because you can display the mushrooms open and then fold them up and close them up and send them on their way when they're purchased. Some folks use the clear clamshells or bags with a clear window, something like that to show what's in there. Generally speaking, a retail customer wants to see the product. A wholesale customer is going to be able to determine the quality of the product from your initial sales, and that ongoing consistency will be important, but it's not as important to display in terms of packaging. So that's kind of up to you how you want to go about it. There's no specific rules, but it's going to depend on your market strategy. Labels, generally speaking, you're going to have the identity, the name of the farm. In most cases, you don't actually have to have your address, at least in New York State, as long as you're able to be found, like through a Google search or something like that. It used to be, and still in some states, you have to have the full address and even a phone number. So do check with your local regulator about what kind of requirements for contact info needs to be on there. And you put your quantity of contents on the package. We could add to this list that traceability, the lot number or the batch number, so that we can know if a customer has an issue with your product, that they can trace it back to when you harvested it and what might have caused those concerns in the first place. As far as pricing goes, what we see with locally grown mushrooms is a premium price. So on the right there, we have our grocery store kind of mass market Shiitake mushrooms. Doesn't matter if they're log grown or sawdust grown, but they're coming from those markets, which might be fetching $3 to $5 a pound, might be retailing for $6 to $8 a pound. What we see from growers over our experience through the small farm program is fetching prices in the range from 10 to 12 for wholesale accounts and 12 to 16 or even more for retail. There's markets in New York City I work with that get $20 a pound. And so what's important to know about pricing is that there's no fixed prices. It's easier to lower prices than to raise prices. And so you start working within the confines of your market and you reduce your prices as needed, usually when you get into larger scales or larger quantities of sale. So here's a graph from a project we did several years ago, showing on the gray bars the average prices that growers were getting per pound for mushrooms in different venues. The black bar there shows the range of prices. So, keep in mind that while the average for farmers markets was around $15 a pound, Some growers could get as much as 20, and some were getting, you know, 10 or $11 a pound. So quite a range there, but really good numbers in terms of profitability, especially when you compare it to the larger terminal markets and things like that we see, you know, the international trade and things like that showing up. And what's key to think about prices is that the way you frame prices can really have a big impact on your sales. And so if you go to farmer's market, it's not really great to put $16 a pound on the sign. That can scare away a lot of folks. Research on farmers markets has shown that consumers like to pay between $3 and $5 per purchase, and they like to buy, you know, 3 to 5 things at market. So they want to spend in that range, and so it's much more effective usually to market your mushrooms as, you know, in the pint form, in the quart form, and say, well, it's, you know, $4 for this pint. And that usually equals about a quarter pound of mushrooms. So you're getting your $16 a pound price. It's not a deceptive thing, it's just the reality, but it looks on the surface as a much more reasonable price for those mushrooms as folks see them. For wholesale accounts, we might offer something like $12 a pound, but say we'll go down to 11 or 10 or 10.50 if you're going to commit to us for the season. Our farm worked several years ago with a small butcher shop, and instead of deciding how many pound units we were going to sell, what we worked with them to do was figure out what a $5 package looked like, because they had figured through their market research that consumers would buy a lot more at the $5 range. And so we took into account their markup for selling the mushrooms, our costs that we needed to meet, and we fit a package. We figured out a volume or weight of those mushrooms that would meet that goal. And those mushrooms sold a lot better than when we just kind of winged it. For CSAs, sometimes you give them that seasonal price, but then you break it down into a weekly price so that consumers are like, oh, I can, you know, $8 a week, that sounds pretty reasonable. And you're going to get these mushrooms for a period of time, and that's a pretty good way to market that. Cool. So that's my basic piece here. I'm going to stop sharing so Willie can take over, and we're going to just kind of cover a couple other elements in the puzzle here from our experience growing and selling and working with other growers. So Willie, I will let that. And if there's questions around those pieces, encourage you to put them in the chat, and I'll keep answering them as Willie talks. And I'll just remind you, we'll post that Harvest to Market guide on the Fungi Ally website, and you can also find it through www.cornellmushrooms.org. So thanks. And Greg, I'll just answer this question as we're transitioning here. He's asking more about that $5 story. I'd have to look back at our notes, but I believe our weight was around 1/3 of a pound or a little more. And we packaged them in that case they were biodegradable coffee bags that had that little window screen, because they felt really strongly that it was important for the customers to see, but they didn't want to display them in a bulk fashion. And so that was a little more expensive packaging, but again, ended up in a greater increase in our sales. So it was worth it.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah,
I'm like, it's really nice. It's like settling to me to just like hear this information, and I'm hoping for other people too, just like, some more understanding of how this whole thing works, and to not be overwhelmed, you know, with like, how do I sell a mushroom? Like, is that allowed? To be a farm. So wish I had that 6-7 years ago, and glad you're sharing all that stuff now. So I want to start out going into backing up a little bit into the grow room and talking about both strains and initiation strategies for the different species. So yeah, I'm going to go through and do that, and then we'll talk some about where maybe we're opportunities there. So yeah, feel free to keep asking questions and being involved, and we'll just work through this. So starting out with shiitakes, the strains that I recommend for sawdust is either 3782 or 3790. So those two are really going to be the highest performing for sawdust. And for logs, 46, either LE 46 or WR 46, or the same strain, are going to be the highest yielding. What's interesting is that 3790 tends to take a longer time to incubate, but the mushrooms are larger. So you get kind of a higher quality mushroom that you can harvest faster, and yields, can, as long as that incubation time is longer, yields can be similar. So I know growers who have gotten out 3790 is kind of lower because they're not letting it incubate long enough. But once you allow, if you let 3790 incubate for 10 weeks, 11 weeks, then yields will be pretty similar between the two different strains. One of the biggest things about cultivating shiitakes indoors on sawdust is that they take 7 or 8 weeks. They go through the first phase, which is colonization of the blocks, which everything does. It's just the mycelium growing out into the substrate. And then they go through this phase called popcorning, where the surface of the block gets all textured and has hills and valleys. And then finally, they go through a stage called browning. And this whole process takes, pretty reliably 7 weeks, 8 weeks, a little bit depending on the temperature. And they're more sensitive to temperature swings and physical shock. So if in week 6, all of a sudden in the incubation room, the temperatures drop down to 50 degrees, a lot of the shiitakes will start fruiting. And same thing, if you go through and kind of whack all the shiitake blocks in week 6, they'll start fruiting prematurely. So you want to have, if you're going to be growing shiitakes, you want to have a good incubation setup and also a lot of space. And this is one of the reasons why some growers will, focus on making blocks of oysters and lion's mane and piopino and buying shiitake blocks in. Or making, oysters on straw and then buying shiitake blocks in. Because shiitakes are such a space hog. And harvest, usually after initiation. So to initiate shiitakes, it's a cold shock, and then the bags are completely removed. So you can see in this photo down here, there's no bag at all, right? So you completely remove the bag after, a 12-hour, 24-hour cold shock, and then place it into the grow room. Harvest typically takes about 10 days. It's very consistent, and they won't fruit for a second time on their own. So you need to soak them, submerge them. Or so first you'd let them rest. So after harvest, you let them rest for about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they need to be soaked for 5-6 hours in order to promote a second flush. So that's really unique to shiitakes, both the removing the bag and the requirement for soaking to produce a second flush. And like I've talked about plenty, fruiting, both first flush and second flush, can be done outside with shiitakes. Sean's asking if you hit the bags like pounding on logs to stimulate growth or fruiting. I haven't found this to be necessary or necessarily helpful, but if the bags are in incubation, right? If they've just popcorn and haven't browned, then and you hit them, move them around, then they'll start fruiting prematurely. So yeah, no need to rough them up in order to get them to fruit well. And Eric, I would remove the bags. So when you're removing the bags is after they have popcorned and browned. So probably it's, 2-3 weeks for full colonization, and then another 2 weeks for um, popcorning, and then another 2 or 3 weeks to be fully browned. And then that's when you would put them in the walk-in cooler. And then as they come out of the walk-in cooler, remove the bags, right? And ideally incubation is, anywhere from 60 up to 75 degrees. Okay, so this is what this process in the grow room would look like. Over here we have somewhere around day 5. And in the grow room, in the first 4 days, like up to this stage, day 5 with the sawdust blocks, you can just blast them with a hose. The shiitakes really like, especially when they first come out of the bag, just have all days washed off with a hose and can just be sprayed down to really increase the humidity level until they have pins that are, like this size, like a fingernail size. After that, you don't want to get water directly on the mushrooms because it's going to create disease. So that's day 5. Then 2 days later, you can see there's a pretty clear distinction between the cap and the stem. And then day 10, most of the mushrooms are ready to harvest. You still have a couple up here that are just pinning, so sometimes there's a little bit of lag. Usually there's kind of like a 3-4 day window of harvesting where day 1 is kind of light, the first day of harvesting is kind of light, and then the second and third days are heavy, and the last day is kind of light again. And here you see, what Steve was talking about on this last photo from the underside of this bottom one being really perfect to harvest, and these ones too. So basically, once you can see the gills, especially in the summertime, you want to go ahead and harvest shiitakes. Okay, so that's kind of taking care of shiitakes and initiation and fruiting room. Now we're going to move on to oysters, which could be blue oysters or yellow oysters or pink oysters or phoenix oysters or black oysters. Any of those would be treated the same. My 2 favorite strains for blues is 123 or 3015. Those are both really high quality strains, fast growing, high yielding. The 3014 is a strain from Amicel that is more like a phoenix oyster. So, or sometimes it's called a brown oyster. So it fruits much better in the summertime. So that's a good strain to go to during the summer, or something like a phoenix is another name you might see for it. There's a new strain of called black oyster. There's some other names, but black oyster is what I've seen most commonly, which is kind of a hybrid between a blue oyster and a king oyster. So the stems are longer, and it's a meatier mushroom, and it has better storability and better yields than the typical king oysters, but has kind of their texture. So that's a new strain. It's just in the last 6 months I've seen people growing it in the U.S. So it's pretty recent. And these are growing much faster than the shiitakes, or they're ready to fruit much faster than the shiitakes. So incubation can be as low as 10 days, anywhere up to 4 weeks or so, depending on the temperature that you're incubating at. Ideally, 73 degrees. If you can have it to a degree, that's where I would keep it. But it's a range, a range is fine. And what's really nice in the incubation stage is that CO2 isn't as much of an issue as in fruiting. So you can just kind of keep the temperature at, in the 70s, and you don't have to be constantly exhausting and bringing fresh air into the room. Harvest again for oysters is about 10 days. And unlike shiitakes, they'll just fruit from the same spot. So you don't have to soak them. You don't really have to move them or do anything. They'll just, 2 weeks later, fruit again from the same place in the bag. To initiate oysters, what I like to do is cut an X in the bag. So usually the bags are laid, horizontally, so laid down like that, and then an X in the bag to expose air, to expose the block to air, right? And usually I'll leave the plastic over where it's pinning, so that it creates this like really high humidity for all the pins to start forming. And this is day 5 or 6 right here, where the mushrooms are pinning. There's really clear pin set, and they'll just push away the plastic X. So as they grow out, they'll just push that plastic away, and you don't need to kind of manage the bags. And oysters, once you see them, typically get to full body, full growth pretty quickly. In the summertime, if the grow room isn't well cooled, we would have to harvest oysters twice a day, once in the morning and once at night, because they just grow so fast. Here you have day 8, 2 days later from here, and then 2 days later you've got this big beautiful bouquet of oysters. When you're cutting the X into the bag, really you're just cutting the bag, but it's not a big deal if you cut into the substrate. So it's not like you need to cut deep into the substrate, or it's really bad if you do cut into the substrate. Really, it's just about cutting in the bag. And you can also do a T. That's another thing. It doesn't have to be a full X. You can just do a T, which I think is kind of what's happening in this first photo. Okay, oysters. Here we go. And other than shiitakes, like oysters and lion's mane, I don't tend to spray with some sort of hose or get water directly on them. It's really best with those to just keep the environment humid and moist, and not get water directly on the mushrooms. Okay, beautiful lion's mane. 2 best strains that I've worked with are Leighton Banks strain and the Lambert strain. The Leighton Banks strain, it's amazing how prolifically it fruits. It'll actually become so heavy that it just falls off of the block. Like it can't hold itself on anymore, and it just plops off, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. It's also not as tight. It's kind of more spread out than other strains that I've worked with. But in terms of yield, it has fantastic yield. Lambert also has a fantastic strain of lion's mane that's a really tight cluster, produces well, and makes nice kind of pom-poms. This like a pom-pom form out of the bag. So those are quality strain. It tends to take, again, anywhere from 10 days to 4 weeks in incubation. And the mycelium is much lighter and weaker than oyster mycelium. So even if you get like spawn shipped in or something, it can break apart really easily, and can kind of look like nothing's there. But there's stuff there, and the mycelium is just a little bit more faint. The harvest cycle for lion's mane is a little bit longer than both shiitake and oyster. Usually it's about 14 days. And there's a little bit more wiggle room of when you can harvest. So you can harvest the mushrooms a little bit earlier and not lose very much weight. Like oysters, the lion's mane will just continue to fruit out of the same holes that are poked in the bag. But it's really important, actually, with both of them, especially lion's mane, to remove any dead material. So make sure that you remove any dead fruiting bodies or whatever's left over. Because if you don't, as the new mushrooms come out, it'll kind of like, it'll incorporate the dead material into it, and that will become a spot for disease. So keeping those bags really clean is very important if you're leaving them in for multiple flushes. The biggest downside with lion's mane is that it's really easy to bruise. So you want to make sure that handling is minimized, and ideally that the lion's mane goes out as quick as possible to the customer. I didn't have a good like beginning of lion's mane, but this picture on the left here is probably like day 8, day 9, and you can see the spines when it first comes out. The mushroom's kind of pink and really tight. You can't even really see spines. And then by day 8 or 9, it's more of this white colored, and the spines are sticking directly out, right? So it kind of looks more like a spike ball or something. Like it might be spiky when you touch it. And then, 5-6 days later, that's when the lion's mane is more in this beard like formation, where the spines are cascading down towards the floor and starting to have, maybe a quarter of an inch, a third of an inch length. And this is anywhere in between these two is a good place to harvest. So you won't lose a ton of weight if you harvest earlier with the spines kind of sticking out in this one, but you're going to get the full formation and kind of classic lion's mane look at this stage. But shelf life, as you leave the mushroom more and more to grow, shelf life goes down. A couple of things that can go wrong in the grow room. One is the biggest one is blotch. So this really happens primarily on oysters, and is kind of a sunken orange like holes that tend to be kind of wet. And it really comes from excess water on the mushrooms. So if you see this on your oyster mushrooms, it can cause total crop loss, like maybe can't sell it. What you want to look for are the orange spots dry, or are they kind of like wet and spreading and rotting? If they're dry, the mushrooms are okay to sell. They might be a lower quality, but it's not like they're gonna continue to have disease and really rot from the blotch. But if they're wet and slippery, that means that bacteria is active, and you definitely do not want to be selling those mushrooms. To cure blotch, if you're starting to get that in your grow room, what you want to do is try and decrease temperature, decrease humidity, make sure there isn't water getting directly on the mushrooms, and increase airflow. So basically, we're just trying to lower the temperature and lower the humidity, getting rid of water, and hoping that this doesn't negatively impact pinning or fruiting. But it's a bacteria, so it really likes high heat and lots of kind of standing water. So minimizing those effects is best approach. This one's a doozy. Neurospora is really hard to get rid of. It's an orange-like mold. It's airborne. It definitely shows up at a lot of different farms, and it's not like game over, your whole farm's done, but it becomes a nuisance. And this mainly comes around when you're inoculating your own bags. So if you're buying bags in, or if you're doing straw, I haven't seen a huge problem with Neurospora on straw. But as you get into some of the supplemented sawdust mixtures, this one can be a real issue. It gets in little tiny holes into new substrate, holes in the filter patch, or just a little pen hole in the bag, and then makes this kind of like cushiony orange growth. So this hopefully won't be a problem for you, and maybe if you see it during when you get to the point of making your own substrate, you're just going to have to increase. It's getting in during the inoculation process. So maybe you need to increase sterilization time. Maybe you need to replace a filter. maybe you just need better personal hygiene in the lab. So that's a big question if it comes up. Okay, probably the most common mold we run into as mushroom growers is Trichoderma. If you do straw, I mean, pretty much all the processes, logs, shiitakes on logs, oysters on straw, any supplemented sawdust formula, Trichoderma shows up. If you're seeing it on your logs, it tends to just be because they're excessively wet. The bark is staying excessively wet. So if you can do anything to kind of dry that bark off, that'll hit the Trichoderma back. Or just, you know, if it's been rainy for a week and yeah, it's been rainy for a week and your logs start to show Trichoderma, probably in the next or two and it's sunny, that'll just go away. Some natural ebb and flow. If it's in a substrate, particularly with oysters, sometimes they can outgrow it. So if you see Trichoderma, I wouldn't just throw away the bags right away. You kind of give it some time to see if the mycelium can compete with Trichoderma. And if it does grow over, awesome. You can go ahead and fruit those bags. And even if it doesn't, say there's 20% of the bag as Trichoderma, you can still fruit the bag, say it's from the space that's not filled with Trichoderma, right? So it would be okay to fruit that bag still if it has a little bit. You just don't want to be fruiting right where that Trichoderma spot is. And the green that you see is actually the spores of this mushroom. So when you see green like this, those are the spores being produced, and the mycelium is a light white color. So you can't tell from the mycelium if it's like an oyster mushroom or a Trichoderma, but the green is a really telltale sign. And that pops up quickly. They sporulate really, really quickly. And never, ever, ever use a bag of spawn with Trichoderma to continue to expand to new substrates. Because it's the spores, that green is spores, then it's not just going to be in that one tiny spot. It's going to be distributed throughout the bag. So if you ever receive spawn with Trichoderma on it, definitely ask for a replacement. Take a photo, send it to your spawn provider, and ask for a replacement. And yeah, make sure you don't expand that Trichoderma out. Yeah, and you could say if you're doing this with shiitakes and you had it out of the bag, you could just cut off the Trichoderma or spray it with some hydrogen peroxide or something, and that would totally be fine. With oysters or lion's mane, it's probably not worth it to go in and try and excavate that stuff. I would just try and cut your X or your hole where the mushroom is fruiting out of, away from the Trichoderma, and that should be fine. Yeah. Okay. So those are some of the pathogens that you might see while you're fruiting and growing mushrooms. The other really common things with oysters is to have long stems. So when we're growing blue oysters or yellow oysters or pink oysters, the quality like tissue is in the cap. So what you want is big caps and little stems. And as you can see with these photos, we have the opposite of that. So this is a really low quality mushroom that most people wouldn't be excited about receiving. So what's going on when you have long stems? Well, two primary places to look is CO2 and lighting. So if the lighting is too low or too short, you'll get these long stems, like the mushrooms are reaching for sunlight, just like plants do, right? So it's a photo period, they're photosensitive, something, phototropic. So the mushrooms will respond to lighting. you know, if you have that 16 hours on, 8 hours off, comfortable amount of light to read a book or something, then you'll totally be fine. The other piece with oysters is high CO2. So so if your CO2 is getting above 800 parts per million, that's when you'll see these elongated stems. And oysters are the most sensitive to it, so they're a pretty good indicator species. Shiitakes and lion's mane will continue to kind of form naturally and properly until CO2 levels get up to 11. And it's like, okay, I need to fix this in the next crop. So once you see really long stems at this stage, then you know that your CO2 levels are excessively high and need to kind of adjust that for the next crop that's coming along. Or even for the next flush, you could just harvest these mushrooms right off and be like, okay, I don't want the block to put any more energy into this cluster, and hopefully it just starts fruiting again in 2 weeks or so. And with really high CO2, there won't be any fruiting at all. So if you get up into the 1500 parts per million, that's when you just get no fruiting. And in some species like king oyster and enoki, this can actually be desirable. Enoki, they grow in the Northeast, and they're a brown mushroom with a regular cap and stem, but they get that long, white, thin look to them, like noodles or something, from being grown in low light, high CO2 environments and from strain selection. So in some cases that can be desirable. All right, so where is the industry? Where is everything? What are some of the other opportunities with mushroom cultivation? This is a article from Wednesday, a week ago, from CNN, and a bunch of different news places picked this up. Just of like, mushrooms are the new celebrity. They're like they're taking over the produce aisle. And in both the quantity of mushrooms being sold, the average price has increased. A big part of what is tracked is button mushrooms and not specialty mushrooms. So the average price right now, I think, is like $4.15 or something per pound. But that's not really accounting for special of total mushroom sales. And yeah, and the amount of specialty mushrooms being sold is increasing as well. So you're getting an increase in total sales, an increase in price, and an increase in diversity of the types of mushrooms that are being sold. So I think it's exciting to see this in mainstream news, and obviously that's gonna, this trend is going to continue. I know last year Whole Foods was saying that mushrooms was like one of the top 5 trending foods. So it's not like this is just like, oh, this year it's hitting news. Over the last 3-4 years, this increase has really been happening. And in terms of production, from 2015 to 2017, there's an increase of 1.1 million pounds produced each year. So each year, the amount of mushrooms has increased, and this year is no different. Still, their mushroom farms are finding, okay, we need to produce more. And what's interesting is that this production is being kind of conglomerated more and more into less farms. So interestingly, this over the same time period, there were less farms. So it makes me wonder why. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that. But obviously, there's opportunities, and I think that I think it's something like 60 or 70% of these mushrooms are produced in the Kennett Square area. And as local markets increase and people continue to be excited about local food, plugging in as small farmers with mushrooms is definitely an opportunity. And what's really interesting over the last year, you've seen a big shift in the large farms from producing their own blocks of shiitakes to actually importing blocks from China. And some of the large block suppliers like KSS Sales and Oakshire have been really struggling with kind of keeping up with those blocks coming in. And it's weird because you can ship blocks in from China, fruit them in the US, and call it US grown, right? Which is a really I'm kind of shocked by that. I don't know if it's deception or like inaccuracy or just like lack of education with that's really special to mushroom cultivation. So that's something that's been kind of unfolding over the last year or two. And if you the blocks that come in from China are more circular, they're like a tube or something, and the blocks that are typically produced in the U.S. are squares. You know, they're more like blocks instead of long tube-like. They're in China, they make more like a synthetic log, so they make the shape similar to what a log would be. And the blocks fruit really well. They're high quality, and the cost is probably $2 less than blocks you can get that are made in the U.S. So, you know, I think this is another thing that's interesting, and over time, as consumers become more educated, because, you know, people that are getting excited about mushrooms and getting excited about local and U.S. grown don't want products coming in from China and then being fruited and sold like they're from the U.S. So as consumer education picks up, I think it'll continue to be a benefit for small scale growers entering the market and local growers entering the market, and just be like, hey, we know where all of our substrate is coming from. We know our suppliers, and this is something that isn't being, you know, shipped across the ocean in shipping containers. A huge area that's increasing is medicinal mushrooms. I'm sure everyone has in some way interacted with medicinal mushrooms in one way or the other, whether you've seen them in the grocery store or you're taking them now or just seen articles about them. This industry is expected to go up to $34 billion worldwide by 2024. So it's expected to, I think it's right now, it's at something like 20 billion, something like that. Maybe last year is 18 or 19 billion. And the projections are that it's going to just totally keep on increasing. So again, there's this opportunity, I think, for local mushroom producers to not only tap into the culinary markets and the food markets, but start to think about, how can I create a product that would tap into this market, tap into the medicinal mushroom market. And there's similar to it, the blocks coming in from China, there's this level of education that is happening with producers that, or with consumers, that I think will slowly shift where people are spending their money in the medicinal mushroom market. So this is the back of a typical formula you might see in the grocery store. And what you'll notice here is that for each of the ingredients listed, you have mycelium, right? So you have chaga mycelium, maitake mycelium, reishi mycelium, cordyceps mycelium. And there's only one here, right here, maitake, which is fruiting bodies. So these actually aren't, a lot of these products actually aren't mushrooms. They're mycelium. It's a different stage of the fungal life cycle. So when you break that down, the total of what's in a serving is about 1,000 milligrams. and only 16 milligrams are from an actual mushroom or from a fruiting body. So that's like 1%, 1.5% are from mushroom fruiting bodies, and the other 98.5% is actually from the mushroom mycelium. And so it's a different different life cycle, different life stage, and there's a lot of questions of are they the same? Is the efficacy of mushroom fruiting bodies the same as mycelium? And when you look at these two products, so here's what the mycelium on grain would look like. It might be more colonized than this, but the thing with growing mycelium is that you can't separate it from the substrate. So you end up with both mycelium and grain in the product, compared with your mushroom, where you know you're getting all fungal tissue, right? If you're using mushrooms in a product, in any product, then you know it's 100% fungal tissue. If you're using the grain, the mycelium on grain, well, how much of the grain is not digested yet? How much is still in just grain, and how much is mycelium? So that's a question that's been playing out in the industry. And Paul in one of his patents says that anywhere from 50 to 70 in like the average product, anywhere from 50 to 70% of the grain might not be converted into mycelium. So that would mean that, of that 98% that is supposed to be fungal tissue, almost 65, 70% is just rice, right? So that's a huge question that I think the medicinal mushroom industry is going to have to face, and consumers, as they become more active in that, are going to start shifting where they're spending their money. And again, a really big opportunity for local small farms producing mushrooms, being able to educate people about what's going on, what's in their products, and developing trust of, hey, you know what is going into this medicine or this supplement that you're using. So a couple of interesting articles here, and in the scientific literature, the big thing that's being debated is beta-glucan content. And typically beta-glucans are what are measured to say if a mushroom is going to have health benefits. And one of the things that Paul Stamets is saying is that, well, it's not just beta-glucans. There's also these arabinoxylines, which can have health benefits. But there's a lot of other products other than medicinal mushrooms where those compounds show up. Beta-glucans seem to be pretty unique to mushroom fruiting bodies. This is, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can look at, Namex put out a really good kind of version of this, talking about what beta-glucans are, what they measure. And they did a study measuring mushroom-based products and mycelium-based products. And they looked at the amount of beta-glucans and starch in those products, suggesting that the beta-glucans are the fungal tissue and the starch is basically the rice. And what they found is these top three are the mushroom-based products, which have, the blue is beta-glucans, so you have really high beta-glucans, and the green is starch, so you have almost no starch. Whereas all the mycelium products, you can see there's some beta-glucans, but primarily starch. So yeah, it's just begging a lot of questions. And what's difficult right now to decipher is that it's only people that have financial interest that are doing these studies. So Namex sells products that are mushroom based, and mycelium based products are their competitors. So it would be really, really helpful to see some third party studies. I know Bastyr did one, and they found a very similar thing of mycelium based products did not produce the same effects as mushroom based products. And at the same time, a lot of this is happening at the like cellular testing level. So very little, if any, human studies have been done in the United States. There have been a fair amount of human studies done in Japan and China, and there are some uh, certified drugs derived from mushrooms that are being used there. But on here in the U.S., we're kind of slow on coming up with that. But in the supplement market, medicinal mushrooms are really, really, really expanding. And likely everyone has been tuned in and hearing about some progress and changes with psilocybin, magic mushrooms. There's been a lot of research at Johns Hopkins talking about the benefits of using psilocybin for depression or PTSD. And recently, Oakland and Denver, and I know that there's another Santa Cruz in California is considering taking psilocybin, like decriminalizing psilocybin essentially. So this is something that it's interesting and is nice to kind of keep your eye on in the medicinal or in the mushroom field, because more and more people are just learning more about psilocybin and asking questions with it, and know that this is a Schedule 1 drug. So I was reading something in Johns Hopkins of them kind of moving towards proposing it be rescheduled as a Schedule 4, which is similar to like sleeping aids. But currently it's a Schedule 1, so definitely don't like dive into psilocybe cultivation. That's a bad idea. But another piece of awareness in the general public and with people of what are mushrooms, what are the benefits that they have, and if you sell mushrooms at a farmer's market, you always get someone coming up and being like, "Ooh, you got any good mushrooms or something?" And I always like to like keep a little paper bag behind with some dried out shiitakes and be like, yeah, $50, and hand them the bag, and it's just dried shiitakes. So it's fun to play with that, and it can also get kind of annoying because there's a lot of benefits that mushroom have beyond just psilocybe. But hopefully at some point our culture is ready to be responsible with this mushroom and use it. And a fun little diagram of function, and then on the right, your brain on psilocybe mushrooms. So yeah, it's overwhelming what is happening there, but obviously things can be rewired and reconnected and seen and experienced in a whole new way, which I'm guessing is why there might be some benefits with untreatable depression or addiction or PTSD, changing the way that we potentially relate to our experiences and who we are and the stories that we believe. So that's our series. That's our 3-week series, and we're going to be posting the application tomorrow. It'll be up by maybe noon or something tomorrow. So definitely check out the application, apply if you want to continue to be part of this project. Again, what we're looking for is about 10 growers that are interested in growing 900 pounds of mushrooms between now and in December, and are willing to collect data and willing to keep working with Steve and I and talking to us. And yeah, and in exchange, you get some consultations and just visits at the farm, 1 or 2 visits at the farm, and $500 for either blocks or spawn. So the application is going to be available tomorrow, and then will be due on March 3rd. So you have like a week or 2 to fill out the application, and then we'll get back to people by about, we'll aim for March 15th, I'm pretty sure we said, if not sooner, because we know it's important to get that out. And for this project, we are looking at one of the 3 methods of cultivation. So either making your own blocks, buying blocks in, or doing oysters on straw. So we're not looking to work with log grown shiitakes, log growers for this project. There was already a SARE project done with log growers, so that's kind of what's going on there. The website that has the application is Fungi Ally, fungially.com /growing-mushrooms, and I just put that into the webinar chat, so you can just click right on it if you would like to. And yeah, the mushrooms, any species is fine. Shiitake, oysters, lion's mane, pio, chestnut. Yeah, any of them are great. Type of straw impact oyster performance? Not that I know of. Not that I know of, Mike. Yeah, Kara, I'll show that slide about the 6 things that identify you as a farm. Sure thing. This one? Is this it? Hope so. All right. Let's see. Let me know if I miss anything, but we'll just answer some questions and hang out, and people are welcome to come and go as they please. And as I said, thank you for attending these 3 weeks, and I hope that you learned some things about mushrooms and just got excited about mushrooms and have the opportunity to had the opportunity to just develop more of a relationship with mushrooms. So tomorrow, talk to some people about mushrooms, just tell them something you learned, and yeah, hope your relationship continues to evolve. And see you later. Yeah, feel free to reach out with questions, and you can contact me at willie@fungially.com, Willie with a IE. And Steve and I are doing a class through Cornell that starts next Tuesday. If you want to sign up, the link is towards the top of the webinar chat box. Anything else I want to tell you? Yeah, yeah. My company, Fungi Ally, sells spawn and grow kits. So if you ever like oh, I want to try this out, check us out. And if you want to get someone a cool Christmas present or something. And also, if you live in Massachusetts or live close, I have a bunch of fans and a couple sealers and a couple of filter, like HEPA filters that I'm trying to get rid of. So feel free to email me about picking those up. And I'll put my email in the chat box. Okay, go work through some questions and yeah, hang around as long as you want. So who did you say was doing the grant for log growing? So Sarah did a grant back in 2007 or something about gathering data for log cultivation. So you can find information about log cultivation either on the small farms page or on the Sarah page. That's not an active grant. I am not currently selling bulk amounts of rated fruit blocks. I'd recommend reaching out to Mycotera or Cap and Stem or just mushroom farmers near you or KSS Sales or Field and Forest. I think they do like eight or 10. I think it's 8 quantities. So if you just want some to try out or something, that might be a good avenue. How do you dispose of the water with lime after soaking? Just I dump it out on a wine cap bed. Sure, you have a pH buffer, but just don't dump it into like an open water source. But if you just dump it, on a grass or something, then it's fine. It just acclimates and goes through root systems and is okay. Neutralizes. If growing multiple species, do we list them all at once in the crop decision tool, or do we have to fill it out separately for each species? You can list them all together, Sharon. So you don't have to list each species. Just say that, plan on growing 20 pounds of shiitakes, 5 pounds of lion's mane, 15 pounds of oysters or something. And it's really reasonable for those to shift. So we're just looking for an average of total mushrooms. We don't have to know exactly. You don't have to do it for each species. It is good to know what your projection overall is. So you can just let us know, yeah, this is the breakdown of what we plan for weekly. And yeah, that'll be good. Fruiting chamber equipment, humidity control sensors, AC, etc. You can check out our course for that, and I think just Facebook forums and stuff. House of Hydro is great for humidity. Apollo fans, really good for moving air. Yeah, AC, Home Depot. Okay, if I have a room with fresh air being blown in, can I cycle the mixed air in the room with another inline HEPA filter or purifier rather than having to exhaust my spores? So the biggest thing, you're not going to, in the grow room, you're not going to need a HEPA filter. And the biggest thing is really you're moving CO2 out. Yeah, you're moving CO2 out. So you're not really going to want to mix air in the grow room. Q-Pair device, awesome, sounds good. You might want to start a little bit lower than that, but yeah, whatever, that's cool. Yeah, as long as you got some capital that you're ready to throw down, then you can totally do it. Okay, do you need to cold shock shiitake rated fruit blocks? Yeah, I'd recommend cold shocking. I mean, basically when you get the blocks in, I just put them right into a walk-in cooler, and then boom, there's your cold shock. So yes. Anthony's asking difference between Fungi Ally online course and Cornell Small Farms online course. Yeah, we both got online courses going. What's the difference? They're pretty similar. Yeah, they're pretty similar.